What's going on, class? It's Mr. Ceballos here, and this video is going to highlight the time before the Civil War and how the United States was before it. Specifically, we're going to be talking about from the country's founding till about the year 1850, because once we get to 1850, things escalate very, very quickly, and that probably deserves its own discussion. Before we begin, I do want to start talking about a couple of resources for this class, mainly that the Bible that we will be using for this course is called Battle Cry of Freedom. It's by a historian by the name of James McPherson. It's what I'll be referencing to anytime I mention information. If in any of my videos you would like to know more, because I'm going to be very brief, I don't want to try to overload you with too much detail because this at-home learning is new for everybody. But if there is something you hear and you'd like to know more about it, please let me know, and trust me, I will dig in this book and we'll find out together. That's the first thing. The second thing is that before we begin any of this, I do want to start with the notion that slavery was the number one issue in starting the Civil War. It is pretty much unanimously agreed upon by historians that without slavery, the Civil War may not have happened. There might have been some conflict and other things like that, but a full, all-out war that took the lives of over 600,000 Americans, that might not have happened if the institution of slavery wasn't in the United States. And I don't want to go into what slave life was like and things like that too much in this video. I will have an assignment for you, a video that goes more in depth on that. But I do want to stress a couple of things, is that founding fathers knew that slavery was going to be an issue, and we'll talk about that. Secondly, slavery is a morally indefensible institution. And what I mean by that is that it was morally wrong, and there really is no reason to defend it. It doesn't have one. It's wrong. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, oh, not all slaves had it bad, and yada, yada, yada. That's not the point. Whether it was the best of circumstances or the worst of circumstances, slaves had to live in a life where they could be beaten with no excuse, and they could be separated and sold from their families without any warning or credence given to how they felt about it. And even if you're treated well, living in a world where those two things just could happen, it makes you live a different life, and it's not a truly full human experience. And I want to stress that, and that's what makes slavery so morally indefensible. But it should be noted that slavery was a terrible institution and that most slaves did not have a good life. But enough about that. Let's get started into the United States before the Civil War. So one of the reasons that I say that slavery was one of the hot issues and people knew about it was even at the founding of the country, the founding fathers knew that something had to be done about slavery. Even slave owners like Thomas Jefferson agreed to such, that the institution would eventually have to end. And one of the first steps they took to doing that when they were founding the country was that they decided that in 1808, the transatlantic slave trade was going to end. That means that after 1808, you could no longer take slaves from the continent of Africa and bring them to the United States. Now, that didn't stop slave trade within the United States. Individuals could still purchase slaves from other individuals within the United States. They just could not be received from the continent of Africa. That's one of the first reasons that we know that slavery was on the minds of people even well before 1861. The second thing we have to talk about is the unprecedented growth of the United States. The United States grew exponentially on three different fronts: from the land, the area of land that we covered, the population of the country, and the size of our economy. But all three of those things, insane amount of growth, almost not seen anywhere else in the world. First, let's talk about land. Just in general, North America, the North American continent, is humongous, especially when you compare it to countries in Europe. You have things like England. England's just an island. All they have to do is fill up that tiny little island, and that's the end of the issue, because then they're right next to their other neighbors in France and other countries. Same thing with like Germany and France. They have these tiny borders and all these very big, powerful nations around them that, they can't expand to. And if they do want to expand to it, it's got to be through armed conflict. The United States didn't really have that problem. We had a bunch of Native Americans lived near us, but they weren't all a cohesive unit, kind of how Europe was. You know, France, its next door neighbor is Germany, another very powerful country. Whereas the United States has different Native American tribes, but those tribes weren't unified really in any meaningful way. So the United States could be like a big bully, and trust me, they were a big bully in that circumstance. So we start off as 13 colonies, and little by little we start to just acquire more land. We get land west of the Appalachians. Thomas Jefferson makes the Louisiana Purchase, one of the single largest land grabs in the United States history. There's one more, and we'll talk about that one. But he basically doubled the size of the country like that. It was insane and unprecedented. And even Thomas Jefferson didn't think that Americans would fill that void for almost 100 generations. But we're going to soon learn that he was completely wrong, that we would actually fill it up much, much faster than we anticipated. So Jefferson made that Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and as it starts to fill up, people start to realize that, oh, slavery is going to become an issue. The United States is confronted with an issue where Maine wanted to be introduced into the United States, you know, the northeast part of the country, and it was going to be introduced as a free state. And this would tip the Senate balance in favor of free states, and southern states were not having any of it, and they threw a humongous fit. Eventually, there was a compromise made in 1820. This was called the Missouri Compromise, and in this compromise, Maine was allowed to come in as a free state, and then they allowed Missouri to come in as a slave state, and they also established what was called the Mason-Dixon line. It had actually been established a little bit before this, but this was a hard establishment that anything south of the Mason-Dixon line was going to be slave states, and anything north of it was going to be free states, for the exception of Missouri. Missouri is north of that line, but it was allowed to be a slave state. This is the first example that we realize that slavery is the hot issue with all this rapid expansion. But another thing happens around this time. As I said earlier, people started to, at the founding of the country, we realized that slavery would eventually have to go away, but something happened that not even the founding fathers could predict. And that's what historians like to call the cotton boom. Around the time of 1815, in England, they had all these humongous textile mills that produced cloth and things of that nature, and they were willing to pay an extremely handsome price for cotton. Well, at this time is also when the United States is exploring and expanding into southern United States, where cotton grows very, very easily, and something happens that makes people start to forget that slavery was an issue. Because people were making so much money, and because the institution of slavery was profitable, cotton starts to boom like never before, and so does slave trade. All of those people who at the founding of the country realized that slavery would eventually have to go away started to ditch that idea and go, man, I'm making so much money off of this. I'm just selling to the Brits at an enormous price and making an incredible profit. I don't have to pay any laborers. I just have slaves. They just live with me. They are my property. And that's one of the reasons slavery is so profitable and was so hard to root out of this country. And then we have Andrew Jackson as a president. And one of the reasons he's significant is he basically cleared out what is all known as the modern day deep south of the United States. Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama. He drove all of the Native Americans out of this area and territory. He opened it up for what would become slave owners, and they would all be producing cotton and cash crops. It was because Jackson cleared out all this land that slave owners were able to move into the South and grow in numbers and grow their economy like it would never before. And I would like to stop right here and just recognize that we gloss over this a lot in United States history, but the driving out and eradication of Native Americans is one of the most horrendous things that this country has ever done. And I know that slavery gets a lot of the talk for that, but it needs to go recognize that what we did to Native Americans was appalling, and it really needs to have a second thought by everyone. I don't want to delve too much into that, but I do think it's worth mentioning. I mean, this is a class about the Civil War, but I don't think that students hear it enough. What happened to the Native Americans in this country really does need to be taken another look at. So we're chugging along, and we get the Louisiana Purchase, and then Andrew Jackson becomes president, and then we get to 1848 with the election of James K. Polk. Shortly before this, we had just annexed the state of Texas, which was also another huge issue within the country, because we wanted to annex Texas as a slave state. Then free states started to raise up a fuss because they didn't want the Senate to be tipped in power of the slave owners. However, there wasn't too much deliberation on the annexation of Texas, because shortly after that, we started what was called the Mexican-American War. It should be noted here that James K. Polk was only a single-term president, but I would say he's probably one of the more influential single-term presidents because of his expansionist ideologies. When he came into office, the first thing he did, literally day one, was annex Texas. And once he had done that, he looked to the rest of the continent all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which was owned by Mexico at this time. So with the annexation of Texas, he basically started a war with Mexico. And once they won the war, they signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And in this treaty, they basically took all the land from Texas to the Pacific Ocean all the way up to the Oregon territories, basically completing the whole half of what we now know as the continental United States. I'll give another side note of how crazy that is. He basically took half of a country away from it. Again, this is a class about the Civil War, but it is something interesting of having a war and having half of a country taken away from it. It's unprecedented and it hasn't really ever happened before, but it's incredibly influential in Mexican history, and if you're interested, that is a good thing to look into. So with all the acquisition of that Mexican land, where we get Texas, what is now New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, Utah, Oregon, all of those places, we completed our march to the Pacific Ocean. And as I said earlier, slavery was one of the big issues in the United States. But one thing that the United States had always had up until this point was anytime the slave issue came up of which state was going to be slave, which one was going to be free, one of the things that they could always fall back on is, oh, there's all more land on this continent. Don't worry, once we get that, then we'll decide how the slave issue is going to be handled. But it was with all the acquisition of this land that James K. Polk did, we now ran out of land. We were at the Pacific Ocean. There was no more expanding happening. There's another thing that needs to be talked about. So all this land acquisition happened in 1848. And I'm sure all of you know the football team, the San Francisco 49ers. The reason that they're called the 49ers is because of the gold rush of 1849. One of the main reasons that California is the largest state in the country is because at this time, this newly acquired land, there was gold found. And it caused one of the greatest migrations of people from the eastern part of the country all the way to the far western part. So even though we gained this humongous chunk of land that was even bigger than the Louisiana Purchase, it filled up almost instantly because of this promise of riches and gold. And so although after the Louisiana Purchase, it took a while for the slave issue to come up, because of the California gold rush, the slave issue came up immediately. So a man by the name of Henry Clay comes up with what is called the Compromise of 1850. And there are a lot of parts to this compromise, but I want to talk about two specific ones. The first is that California would be admitted as a free state. The second thing is that the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. The reason that this piece of legislation is so important to talk about is because a lot of times today, when some individuals talk about the Civil War, they say, oh, the Civil War was about states' rights, that a state has the right to do what it feels is best. Well, the Fugitive Slave Act was loved by every single Southerner and every single slave owner. And it is the least states' rights law that has probably ever been passed in this country. What the law said was that if a slave were to escape from the South, from the slave-holding South, to the free states of the North, it was upon the federal government and the duty of the federal government to extract that slave that had just escaped to the North and return it back to its rightful owner in the South. If states' rights were really the issue, then slave owners and slave states should have absolutely hated this law because it prevented the northern states from having their state right to have free people and not enslave others. Well, that about concludes us getting up to 1850, but I do want to mention one more thing before we go. One of the main reasons that there was such anti-slavery sentiment in the United States was at the beginning of the 1800s, there was this thing called the Second Great Awakening. and it was a huge religious boom within the country, specifically in the northeast part of the country. And although there wasn't too much lasting effects of this, other than just the sprouting up of tons and tons of churches, the other important thing that sprouted out of that movement was the abolitionist movement. With this renewed sense in God and morality, people started to realize that slavery was one of the greatest sins in the world. And this took hold very, very deeply in the North. And this is important because it basically counteracted the same energy and enthusiasm that was created by the cotton boom. The cotton boom caused slave owners to, disregard that slavery was immoral, and they just realized how much money they were making, and then they became ingrained in the institution of slavery. Well, the Second Great Awakening helped people build up and believe in anti-slavery sentiment, and that's worth noting. But that's all for this video right now. Again, I will be posting a video about slavery. I want you to watch that, and I think it'll do a very good job of explaining what slave life was like, the fears, and other things of that nature. But that's all for now, guys. Take care.